Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby-Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome Ambassador Patrick Gaspard to campus this evening. We look forward to his conversation with David Axelrod about his career, the moment that we're in, politically, economically, and socially, and the work that the Open Society Foundations is doing to meet that moment. I do want to mention a couple of our last upcoming events for the quarter. Next Wednesday, General David Petraeus will be discussing his career and the current state of global politics with Natasha Bertrand of Politico. Next Friday, David will sit down with some members of the IOP's Board of Advisors for what will surely be a rollicking conversation about the 2020 presidential race as part of the university's Alumni Weekend celebrations. You can find out about these events and our other programming at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will open up the floor after the conversation to take questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone that will be right here in the center aisle. Remember that everybody's welcome at the mic. We, as usual, do give priority for the first 3 questions to students, and we remind you that a question is brief and ends in a question mark. Please make sure that your phones are on silent, and if you need them, restrooms are down the hall. Here to formally introduce our speaker is Layla Au. Layla is a 3rd year from Dallas, Texas, majoring in global studies. During her time at the IOP, she has been involved in the Women in Public Service program, the USHI Votes Voter Engagement Initiative, and the Leaders of Color cohort. This year, she has been one of our civic engagement interns, and next year, she is going to be a co-chair of our Student Advisory Board. Please welcome Layla to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. In the words of our guest's favorite poet, Aimé Césaire, a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. In his work in promoting justice, democratic governance, and human rights, Patrick Gaspard has committed his life to working towards solving today's most pressing problems. Gaspard entered the world of politics in mid-1980s when he became a community organizer who planned and coordinated New York City-based demonstrations for social justice, education, and labor issues. Gaspard was the executive vice president and political director for the Service Employees International Union, Local 1199, and political director for the National SEIU. He went on to hold a number of positions with the City of New York, including special assistant in the Office of the Manhattan Bureau President, special assistant in the Office of Mayor Dinkins, and Chief of Staff for the New York City Council. His work in New York put him on the national stage, and in 2004, he was the National Field Director for America Coming Together. Mr. Gaspard served as the U.S. Ambassador to South Africa from 2013 to 2016. He also served as the Executive Director of the Democratic National Committee, Assistant to the President, and Director of the Office of Political Affairs, and the National Political Director for Obama for America in 2008. Ambassador Gaspard is currently the president of Open Society Foundations, the world's largest private funder of independent groups promoting inclusive democracies and government accountability. He is proudest of his contributions to campaigns to end police brutality, mobilizations to increase access to affordable health care, and his efforts to increase dignity for working families. Moderating today's event is Mr. David Axelrod, founder and director of the IOP. Now please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Axelrod and our honorable guest, Ambassador Patrick Gaspard.
Thanks, Layla. So it's always fun to have these conversations, but particularly so when I'm sitting with a great old friend, and it's fun to welcome you here. I know your story, but I love your story, so I want you to talk a little bit about that before we get to the issues that you're dealing with today. First of all, your family's from Haiti.
They are. My family's from Haiti. Well, before I go there, Ax, I have to say it's fantastic to be back here in Chicago, which was, of course, the site of our greatest adventure. But I'm terribly disappointed. I mean, I love being here with you all, but the last time I came here, Axe took me out to Manny's, and I don't see any pastrami going on, so I'm a little disappointed.
Yeah,
but I'm thrilled to be
planning.
So,
I will send one to you.
Thank you, brother.
Corned beef sandwich.
So my family is from Haiti,
Yeah.
but I was born in the Congo, and that happened because my father was a young lawyer in Haiti who came of age right when the US-backed Duvalier dictatorship took hold in the nation. I'm sure you remember Papa Doc Duvalier and then his son, Baby Doc. My father had this ridiculous notion that there ought to be free and fair elections in Haiti. Go figure, how radical. It didn't go over well, and one day he actually found himself at the disadvantaged end of a shotgun. And he was told in no uncertain terms that if he did not cease his activism, his mobilizing, his agitation around democratic practice, that he would be disappeared. Fortunately for my father and for hundreds of other Haitian activists and intellectuals, this coincided with the period of rebirth on the African continent as nation after nation was working and struggling to take up a measure of independence and to move towards a post-colonialism. My father took up the call from Patrice Lumumba to come and teach the next generation of young leaders in the Congo at a time when Belgian and French academics had left the country. And my father and 500 other Haitian intellectuals found themselves in the Congo. My father taught there. He was there for a good portion of the 1960s, and I eventually happened. We eventually migrated to the US, and my father used to always joke, David, that he had to flee Duvalier in Haiti. He eventually had to flee the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo, and he ended up in the US under Richard Nixon, and he wasn't entirely sure that he did appreciably better. So I grew up in New York in northern Manhattan, and very early on first became engaged with issues of activism in my own community, Haitian American community, because of my father's activism. Anytime a despot came and visited the White House, we were in Lafayette Park protesting, or we were in Dag Hammarskjöld Park if it was at the United Nations. And eventually that activism helped my awareness of other struggles. And early on, late in the anti-apartheid movement, but early on in my life, I started becoming active on that issue thanks to the leadership of a group of incredible people at in the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. When I was all of 19 years old, the most extraordinary thing happened in my life. It was 1986, and the US Congress and Republican leaders like Mitch McConnell voted to pass the sanctions bill against the apartheid regime in South Africa, stared down the most powerful person in the world, Ronald Reagan, and told him that they feared that he was on the wrong side of history and he was putting his nation on the wrong side of history. And so after years of mobilizations, and for me, a very short period of activism on an issue, I discovered that collective action not only filled me with almost a spiritual sense, but that it was effective and that it could move a country and a people around grand issues that were being debated in the moment, and it could change the course of history. So I was kind of hooked from then on, continued to be active, and then eventually my issue-based activism led to work with unions, with the Service Employees International Union, and through that participation and engagement in electoral politics. And I was fortunate enough to get swept up in the wave of Jesse Jackson's candidacy for the presidency. I started to appreciate that it wasn't enough to be on the outside of the barriers demonstrating, but that there were people who would be passing legislation every single day, and that I needed to find some ways to traffic with them, to engage with them directly, and to try to kind of impose our will on legislative history if we were going to make enduring and lasting change. And that led to some of my work in government.
You worked with David Dinkins, the first African-American mayor of New York. You talked about staring down powerful forces. Ed Koch was one of those powerful forces, the mayor of New York, who Dinkins defeated. And then you worked in City Hall.
I did.
How was it from going from the outside to the inside?
It was profoundly, actually, disheartening and disappointing in the first instance when I made that transition, David, because And I did not appreciate it at the time. I only understood this some years later. But there was this extraordinary coalition that came together to help elect David Dinkins. There were some of us in the city who understood that Ed Koch had this national reputation of being America's mayor. But for those of us in the city who cared about issues like equal access to justice, inclusive healthcare policy, Ed Koch was the guy who was shutting down hospitals in our communities and who, regrettably, was giving the police department license to visit all kinds of brutality on young people like me and in my community. So we had this passionate determination to rid ourselves of the Koch administration. David Dinkins is elected, and the day after we walked into City Hall, I was really young then. Still feel young now.
Yeah.
But really young then. But we walk in, and and slowly that coalition that came together, that kind of animated his campaign around a set of issues, just kind of disbanded, dissipated. Everybody went their own separate ways. We walk in weeks into his term. We start hearing that the Wall Street agencies are going to downgrade the city, that the fiscal crisis is much worse than we had understood during the campaign, and that he was going to have to make really difficult decisions as mayor that would not necessarily accrue to the benefit of those who had worked hardest on his election. And it wasn't until after his defeat by Rudy Giuliani, the same character who he defeated in 1989, it wasn't until after his defeat by the narrowest of margins that I understood that we had demobilized in government at a time when we actually should have been accelerating mobilization and connection to community.
You worked with Bill de Blasio there, who became mayor of New York.
Yeah.
What did you learn there that you took away that if you were to do it all over again, what would you do with government if you had the opportunity? How would you organize it?
I did work with Bill de Blasio then. Bill de Blasio, the current mayor of the city, and somebody who has other ambitions right now. He was the
Who doesn't, right?
Who doesn't? He was the volunteer coordinator for our campaign. And Bill, I'm like the young Haitian, Congolese kid, and Bill's this 6'6" Italian-American kid, and we bonded instantly over the stuffed peppers that his mother used to bring into our campaign. It's always food. David. So in that period, the thing that I was mentored by someone who you knew,
Bill Lynch.
Bill Lynch, the Rumple genius, we called him. Extraordinary man out from a rural community who always liked to sucker all of us to let us think that he was a little country, but he was the most sophisticated political chess player that any of us ever contended with. And I was taken under his wing, mentored by him, and he helped me understand very, very early on that we were just temporary occupants of these seats. I was a young kid, and he made sure, with his size 12 shoes, he made sure every single day that I and de Blasio and all of us didn't allow our position to get to us, our title to get to us, and that we had to maintain some kind of connectivity to our constituency and to our grassroots and to a set of values that propelled us into politics in the first place. It's too easy when you're a young person working in those marbled halls to start looking at all of it as like some kind of a game. And for Bill Lynch and that generation, who weren't just electoral activists, they were movement people who then moved into elections. It was not a game for them. It was about life. It was about opportunity. It was about overcoming struggle. And that was always suffused throughout all of the work that we did and all the conversation. If I could do it all over again, I'll give you an answer that's less a political one and more of a personal one, David. I think that I would have had more of the courage of my own instincts, my own conviction. When I look back on that period, I remark to young people that I was too silent in too many of the rooms that I was in. I was always the youngest person in the room, and sometimes I allowed that to intimidate me, and we didn't necessarily have a culture that invited in the voices from the periphery of the room, which is one of the things that was so compelling about working with Barack Obama. He always invited in the voice of the youngest person in the room or the person who would sit in the back. We didn't have that culture and the dynamic, and I didn't know how to punch through that until several years later, about when you and I were first coming into connection with one another. It happened for me on another mayoral contest in 1997 against Rudy Giuliani again, when a woman named Ruth Messenger ran for mayor, and I worked on her campaign and found myself suddenly finding my voice, and it was a voice that seemed, for me anyway at the time, to be authentically connected to the places that I hailed from, and I felt as if I was taking up that voice with responsibility that was, beyond my own ambitions. And I wish I had a little bit of that earlier and could have done it all over again.
You mentioned Chicago at the outset, and I remember how excited everybody was when you came on as a political director of the Obama campaign.
Little did they know.
What did that campaign mean to you?
That campaign, I always say to folks that for an organizer, that campaign was like being a little kid in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. It was organizing heaven. It was the first, and I had been fortunate enough to participate on campaigns from Jackson, 88, all straight through that moment. But it was the very first time that I felt the central office, the central headquarters, had in a way delegated authority down and had released the strings and allowed people in community who had access to lists, access to data about their own neighborhoods to really take up their own leadership and their own direction and to have their own story impact on the quality of our organizing in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, et cetera, in a way that just was, I thought, unsustainable. I thought there's going to be some point where Plouffe or Axelrod or one of these guys pulls back, but that never happened. It was just such a liberating experience, and one could truly say that organizing was blossoming everywhere in ways that I thought forced and compelled us to be accountable to a particular mandate once we won. This wasn't just about the rhetoric of Barack Obama, but it was instead about the baked-in, organized expectations of folks who voted with some real intelligence.
Well, of course, every organization, including a campaign, takes on the character of the person at the top, and he was an organizer. He was you, and he believed in it. He believed in change bubbling from the bottom up. We got to the White House, and change was a lot more difficult, as he always said it would be, than it felt like during that campaign. You were our political director in the White House during a really difficult time. What was that like, being political director at a time when the economy was cratering and we were asking Democrats to make very tough decisions in Congress and so on?
I'll give two answers to that. The first one is a little flip. I'm going to first say, you can't imagine how difficult it was to carry the title of political director in a White House that included David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel. Okay, just think about that for a second. But it was an absolute privilege and blessing. I'll also hasten to add that I was not one of those kids who watched West Wing religiously, who always had like this notion that I was gonna like go and work in that place one day. It was an extraordinary experience to work on the campaign, but I always believed, David, as you well know, that I would go back to my work in SEIU. And I don't know if you remember this, but in Grant Park, the evening of the victory, you walked up to me in the park and you said, "So, Gaspard, what are you going to do tomorrow?" And I said, "I hope I'm going to be working off a hangover." And you said, "No, the president actually would like to know if you'd go to Washington, D.C. to work on transition. And I thought even then that would be, just kind of like a temporary part of my journey, but then you all bamboozled me into seeing it all the way through. I'll tell you what had the greatest effect on me in that building, David. We all worked from sun up to sundown. You'd be early in the morning, you'd get your briefing email, you'd get into the White House senior staff meeting, and you would stay there until the dogs came home. But walking out of that building every day, I'd always see, no matter what time it was, I'd always see some group of Americans standing outside on Pennsylvania Avenue, looking towards that building with such expectation, such aspiration, looking at it in a way that filled me.
As if they knew that Patrick Gaspard worked in that building.
No. God, if they understood that. As somebody who grew up going to demonstration after demonstration around every war, on every issue in Lafayette Park, and looking to that building differently, it was powerful to have the experience as an immigrant working in the White House and seeing Americans of all backgrounds, all stripes, looking towards that place with some sense that we could solve some of the challenges. So even though we walked in and discovered that not only were the banks in trouble, but everybody was foreclosing on their homes, and we discovered that Barack Obama was about to become the CEO of the American automobile industry. That was a really difficult, challenging time, and we didn't necessarily have a lot of help and support on the other side of the political aisle.
You have a gift for understatement, my friend.
Man, it was the worst of times in that regard, but the best of times because of that sense of expectation, and because we were living in a moment where it was clear that government had a central role in the lives of average citizens, and agree with policy or disagree with policy. People knew that the next set of decisions that the president would make, and those of us who were privileged to be in his company would contribute to, would be of consequence for a generation. I mean, how could one not draw real sense of strength from that?
4 years later, you went to South Africa
I did.
As our ambassador.
The Republicans were more than happy to confirm me, David.
And you arrived there at a pretty eventful time. First of all, you arrived just about when Mandela was passing from the scene. But tell me what it was like to arrive there at that moment, and also facing the kind of backsliding in terms of corruption and other issues.
So South Africa is always featured in my political imagination. You heard me talk about what it meant to be part of demonstrations at a time when we managed to tip things over. But much earlier on, David, when I was 10 years old, 1977, Andrew Young is named ambassador to the United Nations. I knew the role that he had played for Dr. King. I understood the role that he played in Congress. And it was extraordinary for me to see a black man representing the United States of America in the UN at that time, and to hear him pick up very forcefully on the issue of apartheid in South Africa, and to be unapologetic for the need for change there, and taking up the plight of Palestinians as well, which we know eventually cost him his role. But South Africa really started to kind of capture my imagination then. I first met Nelson Mandela shortly after he had been released from Robben Island, and I was privileged to go to South Africa with a group of civil rights leaders, with Mayor Dinkins, with John Lewis, with people like Harry Belafonte and the late Betty Shabazz, and eventually stood up Mandela's first trip to the United States, and then to have an opportunity to serve Barack Obama and the United States of America in that moment, in that republic, just was everything. But I arrived, unfortunately, at a time when much of the dream and expectation that South Africans had for the African National Congress, which was the party of liberation, much of that was being challenged by a leadership that was in place at the time that was profoundly corrupt, and a leadership that was also tilting away from partnership with the U.S. and was leaning towards a closer alliance with Russia and China. It's an interesting moment to be there. And I had to apply all the considerable diplomatic skills that David Axelrod taught me to negotiate a
You
new...
were in trouble.
Oh man, we negotiated a new African Growth and Opportunity Act treaty with South Africa in that period. We managed to maintain our support for the healthcare infrastructure that we've, as the U.S., helped to stand up through Republican and Democratic presidencies in sub-Saharan Africa through the PEPFAR program, and got to be in South Africa at a time when the U.S. partnership with countries in the region shifted from one of aid to one of trade and mutual reliance and engagement. So that was exciting for somebody who had been really steeped in the history, and it was thrilling to engage with young people in South Africa who filled me with the kind of hopeful expectation that your young scholars did that I met with earlier today.
How did you, as ambassador, deal with Zuma and the obvious problems that of corruption, and what role did you play? What role did the U.S. play in trying to urge reform?
Well, I had the good fortune that I was serving under a U.S. president that did not hesitate to call out human rights violations and questions of corruption wherever they surfaced, irrespective of the alliances that we had with countries. So that gave me the agency, the ability, David, to speak out forcefully as well, because I had that political cover. I think...
How was that received?
It was received exceedingly well by members of the reform class of the ANC. It was received really well, I think, by the general population, judging by the responses that I got both on social media and in the streets. It was not, of course, received that warmly by the Zuma administration, but I always tried to stay away from emotion and just random vitriol, and just spoke to the facts that were laid out in case after case by thoughtful activists and jurists in South Africa. But you know, from the moment I arrived, I like to think that I had a different point of entry into the society than some of my predecessors, because of my history in unions, and unions really feature in a significant way in politics in South Africa, and because of those who are credentialing me, like Jesse Jackson, Harry Belafonte, John Lewis, who each sent clear signals about their mentorship and that I was a fellow traveler.
Well, your family history as well.
That helped.
And it was great preparation for the job you have now as president of the Open Society Foundations. The mission of which is to promote freedom, democracy, and human rights. So how's that going?
Well, you know, we're trying to put some points on the board here, David, but we're not doing as well as your Chicago Cubs are right now, which I thought I would never say.
They have their ups and downs as well.
Yeah, but you're at least over 500. I think that you know, democracy is not exactly faring well. Human rights practice is not faring well in many places, not the least of which is right here in the good old USA. I will tell you that it's difficult. You know, I'm proud of the work that I do, and I am enthused by progress that we're seeing in many spaces. But I will tell you, as someone who grew up with a different expectation of the U.S. and was blessed to serve in our government, it's challenging to do this work around the world at a time when the current occupant of the White House is giving license and cover to some of the worst instincts of authoritarians around the world. I remember being in Manila, David, a year and a half ago now, having meetings with healthcare professionals and Catholic priests who were working to push back against the tide of of extrajudicial killings, assassinations, murders that are taking place in Manila that are being directed to those who suffer and struggle with addiction. And the President of the United States, while I was on the ground in the Philippines having these conversations with civil society there was a readout of a call that he had with Duterte, where he was giving encouragement to Duterte's worst, very worst instincts and his worst violations. I've had that experience in one part of the world after another. Right now in Turkey, there's this extraordinary human rights leader, scholar, philanthropist named Osman Kavala, who has been languishing in Erdogan's dungeons for close to 19 months now, the first 16 months without having any charges leveled against him at all. Extraordinary figure who we now understand is jailed because he allegedly participated or agitated around demonstrations in the country in 2013 for rights. And of course, we have Erdogan coming to this country, receiving the validation of our president. We had Erdogan's goons beat up demonstrators on the streets of the capital of Washington, D.C., without any response whatsoever from the President of the United States. We have at a time when all of us need to be concerned about trends towards the developing security state in certain parts of the world, you have a president who is defending the despot in North Korea and insulting a former U.S. vice president in defense of that despot. It's difficult to work on rights in this moment when the U.S., which has been for some time now, the great defender of these values, is not only, if we weren't on the playing field, that would be terrible, but it's worse than that. We're on the playing field and we're playing for the wrong side in far too many places. So it's a challenging time.
Your organization.
Sorry to make it about U.S. politics and the President of the United States, but it is a time, David, when the politics of performance have trumped the politics of principle in too many parts of the world. And I've never seen foreign policy played for a domestic constituency in as rabid a way as we're experiencing now.
Well, he did say when he ran that, his America First approach was that we would look after our self-interest and other countries look after theirs. And his first speech was in Saudi Arabia, and he said, we're not going to tell other countries anymore
Absolutely,
how
but
to run their country.
It is so forcefully in America's interest to have a strong NATO alliance. It's so forcefully in America's interest to have a strong European Union. It's in our interest to make sure that rights are protected in not just Venezuela when there are narrow interests, but also in Brazil as well. And it's certainly in our interest to speak up clearly and forcefully when we are in a trade war with China, and China is basically imprisoning 1 million Uyghurs in the country who are slaves to a kind of rule by algorithm right now. So all of that, I think, ultimately is in America's security interests and in the interest of anyone who cares about peace and rights.
Your organization was founded by and is funded by a huge endowment from George Soros, the financier. How do you, I think you said $25 billion endowment.
Give or take a few billion.
Yes. I would love to have that for the Institute of Politics, but be that as it may. Tell me how you deploy, in broad strokes, how you deploy those resources, the major kinds of initiative.
Thank you for the question, David. So I'm always excited when I get to talk about George Soros, who is the founding
Lots of people talk about George.
A lot of people talk about George Soros, who's the founding chair of the Open Society Foundations. And I'll note at the start, David, that that it says something about the man that our organization doesn't carry his name. This is not the Rockefeller Foundation. This is not the Ford Foundation. This is a foundation that projects straight out a set of values that we are attempting to hold up in the world, and a set of values that we think are intrinsically, by the way, American values, even in their universality. George Soros has an incredible biography, someone who survived the Nazi occupation of Hungary, then survived behind the Iron Curtain, went on through his skill set and his acumen to make an extraordinary fortune, and all along as he developed that fortune, became involved and engaged with rights issues around the world, first in his native Hungary, and then immediately thereafter in South Africa, actually. George Soros visited South Africa in 1979 at the height of apartheid and began to develop his set of philosophies that have later informed his engagement. Right from the start, from his first visit on the ground in South Africa, he understood that he was not the expert on things South African and how rights should be defended in South Africa. And he immediately surrounded himself with indigenous leadership from community, and he extended his resources to them and allowed them to have independent governance and agency of those resources. So now today, we're an organization that is making grants in 140 countries around the world. We have 75 offices in 40 of those countries. And if I went with you today, David, and we visited the Open Society office in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, you would see that it was being led by Haitians who have their own independent fiduciary board. I set their budget, they set their own terms, and they decide who their grantees will be. And there have been instances in Port-au-Prince, if we went to Colombia, if we went to Budapest, where we used to be and only recently left, or if we went right now to Kinshasa, you'd find instances where those independent foundations advanced grants and made a set of decisions that were not necessarily aligned with George Soros' interests, either his independent interests on the business side or directions that he's taken with the philanthropy. So that sense of being invested and dependent and reliant on local knowledge is something that has always animated our organization and continues to do so today. So when you ask me how we employ those resources, we employ it through that leadership, but with a sense of some of the overarching issues that we believe are urgent, that need response from the leading human rights donor in the world, and in a way that we hope takes advantage of the strength of the extraordinary network that we have.
You mentioned that you had to leave Budapest.
Yeah.
And Soros was a big funder of civil society in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the, he was a fervent anti-communist.
Yep.
After the collapse of the Berlin Wall. In fact, Viktor Orban was originally someone who benefited from that and participated in that movement to open things up. That changed radically. And now he has made Soros a target. In fact, Soros has become a target of the right wing all over the world, to the point where you had to close your office in Hungary for fear of violence.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a kind of inchoate fear. When a prime minister of a country, David, comes in front of the public and says that he intends to turn his security apparatus against civil society, against NGOs, and specifically names an anti-NGO bill against, he names it the Soros bill, and begins to, in a very targeted way, go after your civil society leaders on the ground, you know that perhaps the environment is not conducive to your ability to operate with integrity. So yes, we have 170 colleagues, the vast majority of whom served in Hungary through that period, first through the tail end of communism, right through the Great Opening. They are now in Berlin and Vienna as a consequence of those attacks. But what's interesting, David, you said that George Soros has become like a figure of, has become a target for Viktor Orban. It didn't start with Viktor Orban. It actually started here in the United States, and it's actually American, Jewish American political consultants who gave Viktor Orban the anti-Semitic blueprint that he used against George Soros. You may have seen a story that ran in BuzzFeed a few months ago. That was a translation of a piece that was written in Germany that detailed how consultants like Arthur Finkelstein went and helped Viktor Orban understand what was being done with George Soros' reputation in the US and how he could take advantage of that to such an extent that Orban used $200 million of government resources in Hungary to run a campaign that targeted George and that put George Soros' face on every billboard in Budapest and even put his face on the floorboard of the trams that people were riding on with things that could only be described as anti-Semitic tropes and caricatures. But you'll remember the wonderful Glenn Beck show and the poison that Glenn Beck used to spew on our airwaves. On his show in 2010, he infamously had a program where that he devoted to George Soros, and he used signifiers that ADL called anti-Semitic, where he tried to give the impression that George Soros was this ultimate puppet master toying with the economy and politics and government in the US. Regrettably, because we live in an era that's dominated by these tools of ignorance that we all carry around in our pockets, that message from Glenn Beck on the air permeated into social media and just went viral to such an extent that now you have Republican members of Congress who don't hesitate to go on Fox News and to say in no uncertain terms, without any proof whatsoever, that George Soros is responsible for the migrant caravan that's at the border of the US. George Soros is personally paying each and every one of the demonstrators that came to the Kavanaugh protest. George Soros is responsible for destabilizing American interests all over the world. I just find it fascinating that there are certainly not just a few billionaires that are involved in philanthropy, that are involved in politics, but somehow this Holocaust surviving Jewish American happens to be the one that's been signaled and put out.
Well, it was featured in a Trump ad at the end of the campaign.
Yeah, well, it wasn't. Yeah, it was, and there were two other prominent Jewish Americans who were mentioned in that Trump ad
as globalists.
As globalists. So there's a, I'm still. I remember when I was a young man, David, and in 1980. When Ronald Reagan launched his campaign for the presidency, and he launched it in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and he launched it by talking about states' rights. And those of us who knew our history knew that that's where Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney had been killed, and we understood that Ronald Reagan was engaging in dog whistle politics in the South. But now we've thrown away the dog whistle and this stuff. The hatred, the racism, the anti-Semitism is like full-on bullhorn megaphone politics.
Not just here.
Oh, not just here. It's everywhere. I had this wonderful experience when I went to.
You guys can start lining up behind that microphone.
I was in 2 years ago. I was in Kinshasa in the Congo, where my family had lived and where I was born, and I had a town hall meeting. With young Congolese students at the university. And this one young woman stood up and she came to the microphone and she asked me a question about George Soros, and she was reading this question. And halfway through her question, I realized that she was just reading to me verbatim, David, an attack on Soros she was reading it to me in French, but it was clearly, the same piece, the same attack line that we had seen in Hungarian, that had been translated from the Russian, right? So it's not just here. It is all over. But the good news is, I work for a guy who certainly has the resources to push back, and we're an organization that has the courage to continue to work in the tough places and to do the tough things that we believe are the right things on behalf of the most marginalized communities. So the attack, and George unfortunately received one of those pipe bombs in the mail last year. George can defend himself against that. Our organization is big enough to be secure in the face of that. But there are thousands of activists, civil society activists who are engaged on the front line of these struggles, who don't have our resources, who don't have the kind of halo of media protection that's extended to us, that one has to be concerned for every single day.
Please.
Hi, Ambassador Gaspard. My name is Indy, and I'm a first year in the college. So I wanted to ask you a question about many of the constantly shifting positions, like the ambassador positions and State Department positions under the Trump administration. A lot of those often seem like they're constantly in a state of flux. So I wanted to ask you in what ways you saw like this stream of changing officials affecting foreign policy.
That's such a great question. So in my job, whenever I travel to another country, another city, I try to make a habit of always stopping into the U.S. Embassy to take the counsel of the ambassador, the political counselors that are in place. And regrettably, in far too many places that I've traveled in the last 2 years, there's no ambassador in place. And then when I go to meet with those who would be their counterparts with the host government, they tell me that they're not receiving the level of engagement and signals from their embassies and from Washington, D.C., from Foggy Bottom that they're accustomed to. And these are allies and partners who are looking to work with us to advance what historically have been seen as things that are in the lane of U.S. interests, and they're not receiving that kind of direction. I served, of course, in South Africa. I left my post in early December of 2016, and to this day, there's still no U.S. ambassador in South Africa. During most of the period of bellicosity between Donald Trump and the leader of North Korea, there was no U.S. ambassador for far too long in place in South Korea. Place after place around the world, flashpoints, places in crisis, or places where there's opportunity, we don't have the appropriate level of embassy leadership in place. I want to very quickly say that we have extraordinary men and women who are serving this country ably in the U.S. Foreign Service. I was privileged to serve with them and partner with them. But if you understand what multilateral engagement, how it's organized, you understand the importance of having the chief of mission voice, a voice that is seen as carrying the proxy, the imprimatur of the President of the United States, of the people of the United States, and that's significant on issues of commerce, issues of human rights, and general democratic practice. I was in the Congo in that instance that I described before, in a period when it was uncertain whether or not Congo would have democratic elections, which were 2 years overdue. They had elections. Whether or not they were democratic is another story. But in that period, there was a vacuum in U.S. diplomatic leadership, U.S. presence, that was contributing to the ability of the authoritarian in the Congo to slide past norms and slide past his own constitution. I know that in South Africa, which I'm still blessed to visit in my current role, I have leaders from the 600 U.S. firms that are in South Africa come to me constantly to say, you know what, we're not able to engage the trade ministry in the same way that we could when you were in place. And that's not about you, Patrick, but it's just about not having the most senior leadership of the U.S. government in place to take up U.S. interests and to take up regional issues. So it really does matter.
Hi, I'm Cassandra Krevakor. I'm a first year in the college. How damaging do you think this wave of disregard for human rights is for our near future? And as you had phrased it earlier, if America were to play on the right side of this again, do you think that it would be too late and that the damage is like irreversible?
That's a fantastic question, and the easy answer I could give you is that it's really as damaging as your generation allows it to be. So no pressure. It's really on you all. But I want to really be careful in answering this question. I want you to understand, and I hope you will appreciate where this comes from. But I want to, as I take up your question, I want to come at it from the perspective of my own journey and my own history. I don't want you to think that just because I am a big believer in the role that the U.S. has played the last several decades and needs to continue to play, doesn't mean that I don't have a profound and healthy dose of skepticism about our footprint abroad. Right? I'm somebody who, think about this for a second. My parents had to flee a land where there was a dictator in place who had the unequivocal support of the U.S. foreign establishment, the unequivocal support of the U.S. president, and who was propped up by the Central Intelligence Agency. My father then migrates to a land where there is this extraordinary African liberation leader, Patrice Lumumba, who comes into power, and Patrice Lumumba is executed and assassinated at the hands of the Belgian intelligence with the assistance of the Central Intelligence Agency. I came of age in my politics as a young person, having to stand outside the White House as Ronald Reagan was putting his arms around Mobutu Sese Seko and calling him a friend of democracy, when I knew that there were hundreds of thousands of people who were being slain by this person, and thousands who were languishing in his jails precisely because they hungered and their thirst for democracy. In my household, names like John Foster Dulles, those were dirty words in my household. So I have I come by my respect and appreciation for the role that the U.S. can play and has in many instances played in rights by understanding and appreciating some of the most challenging parts of our history, our involvement, and our engagement as well. I think it was, or I know it was, James Baldwin who would always talk about his own patriotism through the lens of interrogation and struggle. And so when I talk about U.S. foreign policy, our interest, our need to be the standard bearer for rights, I understand how that needs to be interrogated, particularly at a time when the challenge of human rights is moving into a different sphere. If you look at what's occurring in the world in the promulgation of the security state that's being supported by U.S. companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook, and I could go on and on and on about the role that American tech companies are playing in distorting democratic practice and supporting tyrants that are closing off the space for rights. So I'm worried about this every day. I have a confidence that your generation is gonna figure this out. But I also know that despite our challenges, despite closing space, there's yet extraordinary progress that we continue to make. And we also have to have perspective on rights practice and on democratic practice. Think about this for a second, if you will. Think about our history. In the course of human history, if you look at nations that have more than 1 million people in them, it is only a recent trend that the majority of those countries are considered democratic nations. If you go back to 1900, there were 19 nations in 1900 that were considered democratic, where people could go and practice their own preference at the ballot box. Fast forward to 1973, and that number only stood at 29 nations that had a population of over 1 million in the world that were truly democratic nations that observed these rights that we hold dear. Go forward to 1993, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we have this explosion that takes that number up to about 1980 to 89 countries. And for the first time, we have more than 50% of nations having the observation of free, fair elections, democratic practice that accrues to the benefit of those who are working in the rights field. But that is a recent phenomena. So much of our assumptions, much that we take for granted, really does not have a depth to it. We are working with a set of institutions that largely came into being, multilateral institutions that came into being following the two great wars. They are a good deal more fragile and vulnerable than we appreciated them to be. That vulnerability is being tested every single day by not only Viktor Orban, but our own president as well. And we need a generation of young scholars like you who do the hard work, who understand the opportunity, the hope, but also interrogate it through the lens of a very difficult, very tortured history that our great country has had as it relates to the promulgation of democratic practice abroad.
Thank you, Ambassador, for sharing with us. Your comment about regretting often staying silent in the room when you were younger gave me the courage to ask my question now. So thank you for that important rubric. My name is Ada Mosai. I am an Obama Scholar at the Harris School of Policy, but the identity of which I'm most proud is that I come from Nigeria. There are three important issues that are currently defining life in Africa today. The first is our population, which is a metaphor for youth. As you know, it's exploding, and experts project this to keep growing. The second issue is our environment, of which the effects, youth and women are the most impacted. And finally, technology, of which youth, again, are the largest adopters and users. Every issue I find that is being confronted on the continent is balanced and shaped and defined against these three critical issues. I'm very curious about how open society, under your leadership, is addressing itself to the new imperative in Africa, which is that young people are not just a constituency, but the basic framing by which every intervention must engage the continent. Could you speak to that?
Thank you very much for finding your voice in this conversation, and thank you for that fantastic question. Nigeria is the most extraordinary place in the world. You have not lived until you've been to Nigeria. It is a country where every young person that you come across is somebody who seems to be working at some new space of innovation and some new enterprise. Really extraordinary place. But Nigeria, for me, points to what I see as actually the greatest challenge and the greatest issue on the continent today, which is not one of the challenges that you lifted up, and it's this challenge of governance. So you're certainly right about the demographic challenge on the continent, and by the end of this century, there will be more young people living in the continent of Africa than everywhere else combined. Like an amazing thing to consider, and that has great consequence when we think about the challenges of the politics of migration, not just migration in Europe, because 80% of migration from Africa is taking place within African countries from one to the other, but it also puts a tremendous amount of pressure on economies and on opportunity. I'll tell you a very quick anecdote as I answer that question. So my first year in South Africa, as ambassador, they were holding their national elections, and I'm an elections geek, elections nerd, and I was frustrated that I couldn't work on an election. So I started just kind of riding around and going and observing the elections in South Africa and going to polling stations and talking to voters. I came across a group of young men who were wearing the red berets and the red overalls of the new nascent decidedly left of center Economic Freedom Party in South Africa. And I went up, much to the consternation of my security detail, to engage with them. And I asked them why they were turning away from the party of Mandela, the party of Walter Sisulu, and why they were turning away from that history. And one of the young men in the group, one who I judged to be the youngest of all of them, looked at me and said, "I can't eat history, I can't feed my children history." So in Africa, there's this tremendous legacy of these parties of liberation, parties of independence that are carrying that tremendous history, and they have responsibility for the future. This generation, a continent where the average the average age is well under 30, but the average age of African leaders is well over 70, right? It's like quite a gap. So, but for me, when I had that conversation, it just reminded me of that gulf and the challenge of governance. When you consider that the collective GDP of all sub-Saharan African nations is smaller than the GDP of France, it like really tells you something about the challenge of opportunity on the continent, and you can't divorce that from the tremendous challenges of governance. I've been excited to play a role, a modest, very modest role in supporting the work of reform that's happening in the African Union around the movement of people and goods, leading to these new regional African trade zones, terribly important for the next generation of leaders on the continent, for this next generation of opportunity. I'm terribly concerned about issues of food security on the continent, which ties directly to your challenge of climate, because of course those who are bearing the brunt of climate change are those in the world who are least responsible for the things that we do that creates climate change. And I'm also concerned about the challenge of demographics that you laid up, but I come at it from a different place. I worry about the ability of some irresponsible actors to take advantage of how we communicate with one another these days through polarizing social media. People who are co-opting the language of liberation and Pan-African partnership in a way that exploits differences, gives them political advantage, while doing nothing to create a more broadly shared prosperity on the continent. So we are engaged in work around migration. We are engaged with supporting young actors who are doing all that they can to step into spaces not only of social activism, not only of business, but also in spaces of governance as well, so that they don't cede the turf to those who are least able and most corrupt. I'd like to continue to engage with you on these issues.
One more question.
Hi, Patrick. My name is Stanley. I'm also a scholar from Harris. I come from Zimbabwe, and we met sometime in South Africa before you left in 2016, and you introduced me to USAID. But my question is, I work in Zimbabwe where there is the challenge of political violence and attacks against the civil society.
Yeah.
So how do you work in countries where the civil society is at risk of political violence? And do you think that the NGOs should include in their budgets the aspect of security?
That's a great question, and it's one that's come up a number of times from our partners. And we at the Open Society Foundations pride ourselves in working in the most challenging spaces. George Soros likes to say that we're the patron saint of lost causes. He doesn't mean lost causes, but those intractable challenges that some others dare not invest in solutions to. So Zimbabwe is a country that I do know well, and many of us were concerned that after what can only be described as a coup in Zim, that it wasn't really an opportunity for true civilian governance, for a true transition. But unfortunately, the international community was too quick and too prepared to give endorsement and sanction to a transition that I think was profoundly compromised. It is a space where civil society is imperiled, and there are some specific things that I think we can do. During the transition in Zimbabwe, for instance, we were insisting that while electoral integrity was important, it was much more important to reform laws that did not align with the constitution in Zimbabwe, laws that were newly passed, the new anti-terror law in Zimbabwe, the new law that makes it nearly impossible to have open public assemblies like this one. And we are having conversations with the internet, with regional leadership, with the African Union, with the business community, who are thinking about reopening their investments in Zimbabwe. And we're saying very clearly to our partners and our grantees on the ground that until those laws are reformed, that one should still hold out on some of the sanctions that sit on those who are in government in Zimbabwe. You're right that we should all consider questions of security in our grant making. It's a painful subject. 2 years ago, I was in Rio. A year and a half ago, I was in Rio, and I met with this remarkable young African woman who came from the favelas in Brazil. Young, brilliant, proudly queer sister named Marielle Franco, who decided that she was going to run for her local council seat. And she revolutionized campaigns in her community, radically increased turnout. She won, and she worked with us on police violence in her community, spoke out against police corruption. Incredible. I'll never forget being in her presence. Regrettably, she was assassinated about 8 months, actually a year ago last month, she was assassinated, we believe, by the very same police forces that she spoke out against and that now have cover from the dictator, the elected authoritarian in Brazil, who has fascistic tendencies. And I worry that in those spaces where we have the Marielle Francos in this world who are brave and courageous enough to speak out in the face of that kind of horrific repression and violence, that not enough is being done by actors in philanthropy to account for security in our grant making. I want to be careful what I say about that in a public space, but just know that is an active conversation that's happening amongst a group of us who invest in rights and who invest in that kind of courage. So thank you for your question, and thank you for your activism on Zimbabwe, a country that used to be the breadbasket of the region and is now, pardoned kind of an Axelrod pun, but now is the basket case in the region on democratic practice, and we've got to turn that around.
Patrick, I started on your own personal story because one of the things that's always inspired me is how consistent you've been in the choices that you've made in your life, and what you're doing now on this grand scale globally is very consistent with who you were as a young organizer on the streets of New York. And it's an impressive story to me. And I will tell you that there are some young people here who have the capacity to do the same. And it's my hope that not only will you have inspired them here, but that you'll also hire them later.
Done.
Thank you very much.
You know what, Axe?
Yeah.
I'm not going to let you get the last word because I didn't do something that I should have done, which is to extend some appreciation and praise your way. One of the reasons why I'm able to be here having this conversation is because of you and your instinct for mentorship, your instinct for inclusion. You've always not only looked out, but you've most especially looked out for young activists and organizers of color in the spaces that you've worked in, and I benefited directly from that. And I'll never forget you fulfilling one of my great wishes. I don't know how, but you knew that Elie Wiesel was one of my great heroes. And you made it possible for me to meet Elie Wiesel and to talk to him about night, which was something that changed my life. So thank you.
All right, brother. Thank you.
Thank you.